Well, hello. Let me welcome you to this noontime seminar. It's the fourth of the webinars that ICER has had this spring, talking about a variety of issues, some of them related to COVID-19. Today, Dr. Mouhcine Guettabi is going to be making a presentation called the State and the Stimulus. Mouhcine is an associate professor of economics, has a joint appointment with the Institute of Social and Economic Research here at ICER. I'm Ralph Townsend. I'm the director of ICER. I know by quick way of introducing Mouhcine's talk that Alaska has had some really unique economic challenges and issues for the last 5 years. In many ways, for 5 years, we were very different from the rest of the economy. The rest of the economy was growing and we were struggling in the post 2015 oil price shocks. The last year, of course, we have had the same major impact as the rest of the US economy. First, in the impact of the COVID-19 closures on some significant parts of our economy, and also the impact of the federal, the series of federal stimulus projects on the national economy and on the state economy. So it'll be really a pleasure to introduce Mouhcine to talk about what's going on with the economy. Just a couple small pieces of housekeeping. One is that the video of this session and the slideshow will be posted on the ICER website by about Friday of this week. The second thing is that if you have questions for Mouhcine during this talk, if you put them in the question, we'll be monitoring the Q&A block, not the chat block. If you put them in the question block, I will be watching those questions and will interrupt Mouhcine appropriately if you have clarifications. So if you have clarifications, put them in. Mouhcine will talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for more open-ended kind of questions at the end. And again, the note that if you do have the question or using the questions, there is a place to upvote. If there's a question in there that you also have, you can indicate that you have the same question, and that will help flag it for me in terms of priority. So with that quick introduction, Mouhcine, let me turn the program over to you to talk about the state and the stimulus program.
I'm hoping you can see the presentation. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be with us. I have about 37 slides. I'm gonna try to go through them reasonably quickly. If I don't finish the presentation, as Ralph said, I'm gonna share the slides. Feel free to reach out by email if you want clarifications about anything that I say. This is a presentation that's slightly different than the one that I gave to Senate Finance a couple of weeks ago, in that it touches on the state of the economy. It touches on how the stimulus money has affected it, if it has at all. But then I've added a component where I talk fairly explicitly about how we should be thinking about the budget. I've stayed away from budgetary discussions over the last few months because I've been doing much more work on the economy, but I think it's a mistake to frame the conversation around the budget as having been solved because we got this manna from heaven or from the federal government of $1 billion. And I just kind of want to touch on a couple of elements that I think are important to keep in mind as the conversation heats up over the next couple of weeks. So a few things. I think that the pandemic and the size of the shock that the Alaska economy has experienced has made a lot of people forget that we were in a recession for 3 years between 2015 and 2018, and that the depth of that recession has been dwarfed by the shock that we're currently experiencing. But it's really important that we had not come out of that recession, that in 2019, the only year out of the last 5 years where we experienced growth, that growth was fairly anemic. And the vast majority of the sectors in the economy were still well below their 2015 levels in 2019. And so the pandemic has obviously affected every sector, every region, but they hit an economy that was very, very slowly emerging from that very deep shock of the oil-driven recession. So where do we stand right now? The Alaska Department of Labor does a really great job of updating us month by month over what's going on. As of March of this year, we have about 21 or 22,000 fewer jobs than we had in March of 2020. I need to say this now before people start leaving, but next month, something very wonky is going to happen. Next month is the very first month where we're going to start comparing employment levels after the pandemic hit to April of 2021, which means that next month you may see a headline saying, oh, employment has gone up, but it's going to be because we're comparing April 2021 to April 2020, a month where we had already started experiencing some of those negative employment shocks. One thing I will say is everything that's in blue is clickable. Last July, I produced a fairly detailed forecast, kind of laying out where I see the economy going for the next 24 months. It's by sector, has some fairly strict assumptions about what was going to happen to oil prices, what was going to happen to tourism. Clearly, the news around tourism has not been all that positive over the last few weeks. Big question mark. And that's a very significant headwind that could potentially change the landscape quite considerably. I'm going to give a brief summary again. I know that people's time is precious, but I want to say a few things here so that we can set the stage. The employment landscape, the technical term for it is that it's incredibly ugly. However, one of the very strange things that has happened during this recession that has never happened before is that personal income in Alaska, just like every other state, has actually gone up. And that's one of the places where this federal funding or stimulus intersects with the state economy. Employment numbers have not recovered. They don't show any sign of organic recovery. But the amount of the stimulus that has entered the Alaska economy, and when I say stimulus here, I'm using a broad term for individual payment, for unemployment insurance, for PPP, the amount of that federal money has dwarfed the losses that have occurred in the labor market, which means that personal income has gone up. It's gone up in every state. And this, however, does not mean that all is good, that there aren't people that are struggling, that there aren't sectors that are struggling, that there aren't communities that are struggling. Just means that the pie, if you will, of overall personal income is higher. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's going to be really important when we talk about aid to talk about targeted aid as opposed to simply helicoptering money into the economy, because a lot of people that have kept their jobs have also received some of this federal funding, and the level of savings in the economy as a whole is much higher than it was a year ago. GDP, gross domestic product, if you were to pull out those transfer dollars and focus on the value of goods and services that the economy produces, is down by about $2.5 billion. These are fairly recent numbers. They're estimates by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they show that GDP is down about $2.5 billion. So again, there are very real signs that the economy, unsurprisingly, is much weaker than it was a year ago. However, we have this personal income aberration, if you will. It's explainable, but it's something that gives people pause, and I think is important to take into account when we start having this conversation about how should we allocate aid, who needs money, who needs help, who doesn't need help. I'm going to talk a little bit about whether or not there is research that tells us much about how people are using stimulus money, whether PPP has been effective or not. Take some of it with a grain of salt. This is research that's being done in real time. Some of it is better than others, but I think it still gives us some understanding as to where we are. What we can't do at this stage is peel that onion properly and tell you exactly how each of these distributions have affected economic activity, or have affected a region, or have affected a particular sector. So the summary from the budgetary standpoint, I think is important to start with as well. What I really want to communicate, and I think this is important, I've mentioned it on Twitter a few days ago, that I feel like the framing has shifted over the last few weeks towards, oh, we have all this money right now, and that means that problems are solved. I think that that's a fundamental misreading of what's going on. A one-time injection of $1 billion does not solve the structural issues. And the other thing is that I started wondering whether I was wrong or not. In 2019, I and Nolan Clouda did that analysis of the economic impact of the vetoes. And I started thinking, the sky was falling in 2019 when we were doing that analysis, when the vetoes were announced. I wonder what oil prices were when we were all saying that the budget situation is awful. And I went back and I looked at oil prices in August of 2019, and they were $65. And oil prices right now are around $65. So from an oil price perspective, at least we are in exactly the same situation we were in when we were talking about the sky is falling and the budget situation is going to be difficult to deal with. My point is nothing has changed as far as I'm concerned, right? And so the structural issues are still here. The permanent fund cannot support both a statutory dividend and funding government. And the new spring forecast that DOR has released has within it fairly optimistic oil prices. I'm not smart enough to forecast oil prices, and I trust their judgment, but it's important to acknowledge that even with all of that, we still have a deficit if you want to pay the statutory dividend and pay for the current level of government without talking about inflation, without talking about anything else. So really my point here is nothing has changed. And I think that that's kind of something that we need to acknowledge in order to have a good and serious conversation about the state of the budget. So I'm going to show you this picture, and I'm going to pause for a bit because I think from an economic perspective, I think it's probably the most important picture that we're going to be talking about today, because what this tells you is each sector in each year relative to March of 2015. So all the employment here is using March employment levels. And so I'm just going to pick on construction. So this is telling us that in March of 2018, construction employment was 84% or 84.9% of March 2015 levels. The reason I'm showing you this is to highlight the point I made earlier, which is that the vast majority of the sectors in the economy were below their March 15 levels even before the pandemic. So let's skip to mining and logging. That's mainly oil and gas. As of March of 2019, mining and logging was 74% of its March 2015 levels. That means that we had lost essentially a quarter of the jobs that were in mining and logging by March of 2019, right? And as of March of 2021, so these numbers have within them both the recession-driven declines as well as the pandemic-driven declines. By March of 2021, mining and logging is 60% of its level in March of 2015. And so these are structural, deep shocks. And if you look across sectors, you see that very few sectors are above that 100%. What does 100% mean? It simply means that your level of employment in March of that specific year is higher than March of 2015. The only sectors for which that's true is education and healthcare services. That's simply healthcare, mainly healthcare and some private education, federal government, and some leisure and hospitality pre-pandemic. Aside from that, the vast majority of the sectors are well below those levels. So why am I harping on this? I'm harping on this because I really think it's important to acknowledge the weakness in the labor market that existed and shape the conversation around what should we do in order to build this Alaska 2.0, because there was no organic growth. The 1 year where we did experience growth, that's 2019, and you can look at the numbers yourself, that growth was fairly anemic. And so I think that unless we acknowledge that, it's going to be really hard to kind of start thinking about how should we position the economy going forward. So I had estimated that it would have taken a decade to recover the 11-some thousand jobs that we had lost between 2015 and 2018, even without the pandemic. Now you add the pandemic into it, and we're looking at, again, the technical term, jokingly, is an ugly picture, right? And so it's just that it's, when I look at this, you have to pause and say, what are the catalysts, right? What gets us out of this kind of anemic growth and what gets us to the other side? And there are really no clear answers at this stage. What I do know is if you turn your attention to total employment, that's here that I'm circling right now, we were at about 9 in March of 2020. So that's the last month for which we had okay employment. In March of 2020, we had about 97% employment of the March 2015 levels. As of March 2021, we're now at about 90%, or we're 10% below March 2015 levels. And you know, of course, the economy is going to grow in the latter part of this year. We are going to grow in 2022, but growth and recovery are obviously two very different things, and acknowledging that is important. So I'm going to go from one ugly picture to another ugly picture, but this one kind of zooms in on the pandemic specifically. And what I want to show you here is just how each sector has been affected by the pandemic. So what this does is it compares each month to that same month the previous year. A couple of things that I would like to highlight here is every sector in the economy was affected. No two sectors were affected the same way. That if you look at February and March numbers, those are the numbers in months before the pandemic. Those growth rates were very small, right? And so that's basically the picture of the economy before the pandemic. Now, have we seen recovery? I would be hard pressed to say that we've seen a recovery. Some of the declines have shrunk. Healthcare is the one sector, that and construction really are the only sectors that are starting to near pre-pandemic levels. Leisure and hospitality has been struggling for months, continues to struggle. I need to point out that you all know this, but the Alaska economy is immensely seasonal, which means that employment balloons over the summer. And last year, we missed out on all those summer jobs. There is a very good likelihood we're going to miss out on many of them. So in many of these sectors, we may end up again having these losses grow over the summer because typically the economy again expands. The thing that I hinted at earlier is for all those of you that keep up with these numbers, just be very careful in interpreting the April numbers, because that's going to be the very first month when we're comparing April of this year to April of last year. And April of last year was the month where we experienced those very sharp declines. Same picture, but now turning the attention rather to a sectoral decomposition. This is what I refer to as a regional decomposition. This is total employment, but that total employment is broken out by a region. Again, this is Alaska Department of Labor data that they provide on a monthly basis. And so all I'm doing here is graphing it to show that there is very significant variation in the shocks by region. Why? Well, naturally enough, it's because of industrial composition. That's basically saying it depends on what your economic bases are, what your drivers are, and the more sectors you have that were exposed to the pandemic, the more those losses are. One thing that's important to note is that even within region, there is variation. What do I mean by that? If you zoom in, for example, in the northern region, North Slope, Northwest Arctic Borough, most of the losses that we're seeing in the northern region are driven by the North Slope. Why? Well, North Slope is oil driven, Northwest Arctic Borough, more mining. Mining was not as affected as oil, and you get this variation. And that's the case across the economy. I'm a trained regional economist, so I think about regions a lot. I think about sectors a lot. But I think that on a high level conversation, this stresses, again, targeting. And I know that people are bored with the targeting conversation, and it's difficult to do, but I don't think that it makes any sense for us to just say, we're going to inject more money into the economy, and that's going to solve problems, because not everybody is affected in the same way. Just quickly, this is going back in time. So the last slide that I showed you was using March data. We don't have a breakdown by borough for March. This is going back to September. But just to highlight the point that I was making, which is that there is massive variation in employment shocks. If we were to poll the audience and say, what do you think are the communities or boroughs that are most affected? You would have probably guessed Denali and Skagway, given their tourism dependence. And that's exactly the case that we're seeing. And so there is no surprise here. But again, if you ask people that think about local government revenues or that think about local employment, they will tell you that the coffers of communities or preparedness or shocks or declines in economic activity vary a ton. And so again, the aid, in my opinion, needs to also be varied, because we just have this, we like to say it's the state economy, but we have many mini economies within the state, and it's impossible to not take that into account. I know I'm 20 minutes in and I'm only 10 slides in, but I'm a long-winded fellow. And so I'm gonna just kind of skip fairly quickly through these. This is an alternative measure of economic activity. These are initial claims. This is basically people newly filing for unemployment, if you will. The picture takes a form that many of you, again, would have guessed, meaning that we saw an explosion in initial claims, and then we saw a drop. But if you go to the very right of the graph, you see that unemployment claims or initial claims are still elevated relative to pre-pandemic levels. So on the left side of the graph here that I'm highlighting, you see that it's a boring series. Typically, we hover around 900 claims a week, and it really does not change that much. And then you see on the very right of the graph that we are still at about 4 times the level of pre-pandemic numbers, which means, again, there is still pain. You're not surprised, because I just showed you that we're running at about 20,000 fewer jobs than we had last March. Same picture, continuing claims. So rather than new people filing, these are the number of people that had already filed in a previous week. Continuing claims, again, have dropped significantly from pre-pandemic, from the peak, but they're still elevated. We're about twice as many claims as we had beforehand. And again, the question is, if we miss out on that summer season, what happens to these claims? How many of these people have been unemployed for a long time? The Department of Labor did a nice series trying to delve into who are these people, where do they live, how long they've been unemployed. And I think that that's important, again, because scarring effects are very, very problematic for an economy, meaning that there are negative consequences to having a ton of people that are unemployed for an extended period of time, because getting them reattached to an employer becomes difficult the longer somebody is unemployed. That's why I think it makes sense to start thinking about allocating money towards trying to play matchmaker in the labor market and encourage employers to take on workers as this recovery goes on. Last time I gave a version of this presentation, I got quite a few angry emails because I said that there is research that's showing that the unemployment insurance payments or the expanded unemployment insurance payments really did not cause decline in willingness to accept jobs. And there is headline after headline saying, oh, look, there are all these small businesses that are struggling to find workers. Of course, that's the case, meaning the research shows on aggregate, what have they found as a result of those initial payments? This does not mean that there are no employers that are struggling to find workers. However, it's really hard to know what's driving this hesitancy, if we can even call it that, meaning partially maybe it's the more generous payments, partially it's fear of the virus, partially it's that wages are too low. There is a new paper that came out 2 weeks ago that's finding some merit. They're exploiting the variation in these unemployment insurance payments, and they're finding that a 10% increase in the generosity finds that there is a 3.6% decline in application. One thing they highlight is that this did not dissuade employers from posting vacancies. So they argue that while the number of people that are seeking jobs has indeed been negatively affected partially by the generosity of the payments, the vacancies continue to go up, which means that there is tightness in the labor market. So they're basically saying from a welfare standpoint, this is not all that bad. Now, if you're somebody that's a small business that's struggling to find an employer, you're saying, well, I'm not sure that this helps me very much. But again, this is aggregate research, not using Alaska-specific data, using fairly detailed data at the national level. I'm going to pivot from bad news to the place where there is good news, which is personal income. I define it at the top of the slide, so I'm not going to read it for you. But the thing that's really important to note is this is in billions, right? And so personal income actually went up. It's about $47 billion in 2020. And this is, again, the statistic that's most surprising, right? And so, wow, you just spent the last 20 minutes depressing us, telling us all this stuff, and now you're saying that personal income's gone up. My very basic explanation is that the losses I was talking about are labor market losses. Personal income here, the important portion in the definition is transfer payments, right? And so the transfer payments have exceeded the losses in earnings. And so what do you get? You get personal income increasing. Now, one thing that's important to note is it's increased on aggregate. This does not mean that, again, the 20,000 people that are unemployed are doing great. It's gone up because a lot of the aid has gone towards people that kept their jobs. And so we have now more money floating in, not the economy, in people's bank accounts, essentially, right? And so one of the questions is, we read about pent-up demand, people wanting to go out and spend some of this personal income, and it will certainly help the economy when people do start spending again. The question is, how quickly do they start spending? And how do we now take this money or this information into account when structuring any additional payments, any additional aid, any additional assistance to the economy?
Mouhcine, just to put something in here, we do have some site-limited folks in the audience. So when you put the graphs up, could you just describe them?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So what I am doing in slide 14 is basically decomposing the personal income, so to give a better sense of why personal income went up. So what I'm showing you here, the maroon bar shows the increase in transfers that has occurred between 2019 and 2020, and the teal bar is the sum of the orange, the black, and the maroon bars. So what does that mean? That simply means that the declines in net earnings, those are wage losses, if you will, plus the declines in dividends, were much smaller than the overall amount that we received in transfers. That's how you get this plus $1.4 billion in personal income. Now, I'm just going to repeat it one more time. when I say there is more personal income, this is not necessarily money that's being spent. This is not necessarily money that's hitting retailers. This is money that's potentially in people's bank accounts. And it does include unemployment insurance. It does include transfer payments, and it does include PPP, because that goes towards proprietors' income in the way that the BA does these calculations. So just a quick summary about personal income. This is not an Alaska only story. This is a story that's happened in every state. This is a result of how aggressive the federal government was with its aid. In my opinion, that was really good. And the economic situation would have been far worse in the absence of this aid. Clearly, we don't have the counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened in the absence of the aid, but I'm fairly comfortable saying that things would have been uglier in the absence of said aid. So even though personal income went up, our increase in personal income was actually one of the smallest in the country. Relative to 2019, personal income went up by about 3%. The only two states that had more anemic growth in personal income were Wyoming and Connecticut. Wyoming, I understand. Connecticut, don't ask me why. Maybe Wall Street people lost a lot of money. I'm not sure, but it's interesting to see the variation in this change in personal income. I'm gonna roll through this quickly. GDP actually went down. Personal income and GDP are fairly correlated, but the big difference this time around was that transfer from the federal government. That's data that's clearly not in GDP. GDP is gross domestic product. And so it's the value of goods and services produced in Alaska. Alaska's GDP is around 50-some billion dollars. So what I'm showing you here are the quarterly numbers. So that doesn't mean you add up those quarterly numbers to get to Alaska GDP. That's annualized GDP by quarter. The big decline in GDP happened in the second quarter. And surprisingly, that's your April, May, and June of 2020. That's when we saw the big slide. We've recovered some, but we're still well below pre-pandemic levels. And so again, the graph is simply showing you GDP by quarter for both 2019 and 2020. And the thing that's really stark is what happened in the second quarter of 2020, where we saw that very significant decline in GDP. And that's what's still dragging us, right? And we saw some recovery, again, as stuff started to reopen, as people started to go out, as we got the vaccine out, but we're still dragging well below pre-pandemic levels. Last slide on GDP, and it's just, this is growth in real GDP. So I'm showing you 4 bars from left to right. So that's the percentage change in GDP between 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19, and then 19, 20. I want to make 2 points here. One is that GDP growth was very small even before the pandemic. So GDP recovery typically precedes employment recovery, which is what happened in this recession, meaning the oil-driven recession. We saw employment growth in 2019, but we saw GDP growth in 2018, very small. And then we saw again GDP growth in 2019, very small as well. So where does this leave us? Again, an economy that is experiencing this very large shock in GDP losses coming on the back of a recession between 15 and 18, smaller gains in GDP in 18 and 19. So that means that, again, those economic drivers that we've historically relied on are struggling, and it's tough to see what the catalyst will be going forward. I do anticipate GDP is going to recover, but again, it's going to be growing from a low base. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. Fairly quickly here, real GDP declined everywhere. A lot of what I'm telling you is that the pandemic, unsurprisingly, hit every state. The declines are not an Alaska-specific story. What's Alaska-specific is that we were coming into this pandemic, I don't want to say unprepared, but in fairly rough shape economically, right? Which complicates our emergence out of it. I'm pivoting again, and I just wanted to talk about the stimulus. The stimulus was one of the things I wanted to talk about specifically. This is my attempt at understanding how much individual distributions were given to households specifically. So this is, these are the 3 rounds of stimulus plus the PFD. What you see in the 4th column is the federal cost of those individual stimulus payments. What you see in the 5th column is the approximate amount received by Alaskans. This is my attempt to calculate how much of the federal pie was received by Alaska. And then the last column shows you how much Alaskans that were eligible received, and that's for a family of 4, right? So those are individual amounts, if you will. And so what I'm showing you here is how much people would have received if they were eligible for every single round. If you add up all of those columns or all of those rows, and I'm including the PFD here because it fits within the timeline, a family of 4 that was eligible for every stimulus payment, in addition to the PFD, would have received a little more than $14,000 over the span of this last year. That's a little more than $2.5 billion that has been injected into the economy if we add up the 3 stimulus payments plus the PFD. So again, large amounts. Some of it clearly is going towards people that need it and that are struggling. Some of it went towards people that have kept their jobs. They may also be struggling. But this is a sizable amount of money that is partially also explaining why personal income went up in that previous slide. But I think that this, to me, this exercise helped me try to kind of zoom in on why personal income was going up and where this money is coming from, and why we see statistics at the national level showing that savings rates are much more elevated than pre-pandemic. These are slides that I've talked about before, so I'm not going to spend time on them. I'm already at 12:37. This is spending. And so I've relied quite a bit on consumer spending data. It's from tracktherecovery.org. And it shows that spending was negatively affected by the pandemic. It's been increasing or improving since. This is credit card and debit card information. And so this is real spending data. But we're still well below those pre-pandemic levels. Same information using business revenues or small business revenues. And again, what we're seeing here is small business revenues were negatively affected by the pandemic. They seem to have responded some to the distributions of those stimulus payments, but they're still also lagging those pre-pandemic levels. And that's one of the reasons why we are all concerned about business closures, right? We don't have great data on that, but everybody that pays attention to this is concerned about how many businesses we've lost, how many businesses will be able to survive these much smaller seasons of spending and potentially no tourism season. This is a summary of the research. What I want to tell you here, and I'll share this with you, is that most of the work shows that spending, unsurprisingly, did respond to the stimulus payments. And so you can go back to this graph and you can see here that spending did indeed increase as a result of the stimulus payments. So there is research that tried to actually tease that out, and they do find evidence for a causal relationship between the stimulus payments and spending. The first paper finds that about 29 cents out of every dollar was actually spent on expenses, food, rent, and bills once those stimulus payments received. This is a graph that I think is useful. but it shows something incredibly intuitive. You don't need me for this. The dark blue shows you the share of stimulus payments that were used for expenses. And then what we have on the left side is we have income groups. And so what's the conclusion here is lower income households spent a larger portion of their stimulus payments on expenses. As you go up in the income distribution, the share of the stimulus payment that was going towards expenses shrinks. If you focus on the red bar that shows you the share of stimulus payments going towards savings, the opposite is true. Meaning as you go up in the income distribution, the share of the stimulus payments that are being saved increases. So what does this mean? People that were cash poor got the stimulus payment, spent a big portion of it. People that had cash reserves saved a lot of it. This is from the pulse survey that the census does. This is national data, but there is an Alaska specific portion of the survey. It has fairly small response rate, so I'm staying away from it. This is just research on the PFD, so I'm gonna skip it. The research on the PPP is probably disappointing to most people because the findings are not as encouraging as most people that were excited about PPP thought initially. This does not mean it was a failure. It doesn't mean it was a waste of time, but the national research shows that the number of jobs saved as a result of PPP were smaller than those overall number of jobs that employers said they were going to retain if they received PPP payments. That's probably not terribly surprising because not every job that was supported with PPP was a job that would have disappeared in the absence of PPP. So let me again be clear. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have done PPP. I'm not saying that employers did not benefit. I'm just saying that those grandiose numbers that were being showcased in the media are not necessarily the ones that were being saved, whether nationally or in Alaska. I've talked about this before, but I think something that's not getting a ton of attention is we talk a lot about the money that the state is getting. We talk a lot about individual stimulus payments. The child tax credits are a massive, massive improvement over what we previously had. 2 points that matter here are the child tax credits are fully refundable and there is advance payment. So that means households that are eligible for these payments could potentially start receiving checks about $250 per child starting June, and those would last until December. It's important to note that those payments are temporary, but they're a big, big payment that lower income households, for the most part, will be receiving. And so that's an additional boost to lower income households and potentially a big boost to the economy because the overall amount of money entering the economy will be large once we figure out exactly how many people will be getting them. 2018 data shows that about 90,000 people received, had 90,000 tax returns had child tax credits within them. So I have 4 minutes that I'm gonna reserve to the budget. This graph really to me is important, and I encourage those of you that have power and think about this stuff to think about it. So I highlighted 2 things here. The first one is August 2019. This is data. This is just oil prices from March 2019 to April 2021. This is August. This is when the budget vetoes were announced. Oil prices were $61. Oil prices in March of 2021 were $65. So to me, if the urgency was driven by the decline in oil prices in 2019, we should be under basically the same level of urgency because oil prices are not twice what they were 3 years ago. And so I think that this is really important to keep in mind when we're having these conversations. Plus, there is no way to know where oil prices are going to be, but nobody's forecasting $120 oil prices. So the idea that the budget is magically going to get balanced through oil price recovery alone is just not going to happen. Another point, Department of Revenue does a really good job of releasing their forecasts every year. But I want to highlight something is that much of the optimism around the budget is driven by their revised forecast, where they used a much higher price level, I think realistic, but much higher. The orange bars show you petroleum revenues under the spring forecast. The green bars show you petroleum revenues under the fall forecast. And essentially the spring forecast almost doubles petroleum revenues. That's partially driving this enthusiasm, optimism over the budget, but it's important to acknowledge its source. And I think that this is part of it. But even with this optimism, we're still gonna fall short if you wanna pay full dividends and pay for government services without any additional revenues. This is a picture that's kind of decomposing this. This is overall revenues that have within them petroleum revenues, permanent fund revenues, and then everything else. The red bar is the FY 2022 level. This does not have the additional $1 billion in federal funding. So if we focus on 2022, what do you see here? In 2022, right now, the red bar shows you the proposed spending level. That's your 4.3 something. The overall amount of money is 4.7 billion. So we have basically, this is pre-PFDs, by the way. So we have an additional 360 some million dollars after you've funded government. Now, let me walk you through a simple exercise. What does this mean? So fund government at 4.3, you have 360, and then we have this additional billion. So at 1.3, so you can say that we have a $1.3 billion surplus. That of course means that you haven't accounted for the dividend. What does $1.3 billion buy you in dividends? It buys you basically dividends at about $2,000. Those are one-time distribution, right? So if you fast forward towards 23, 24, 25, you're seeing that, okay, well, this doesn't look so bad. Revenues are higher than the level of FY22 spending. That's true. That's contingent on oil prices staying where they are, but this is also pre-PFDs. And as I'm going to show you here quickly, I'm going to skip this. It doesn't really have information. This is really important to note. So this is slide 31. What does slide 31 show you? I think it shows you something that's important. So what I do is the green bars are just using, those are revenues using Department of Revenue numbers. And then what I do is, so the green bar basically says all the permanent fund draw is going directly towards government. And then in the orange bar, I say, let's think about actually doing 50-50, right? And so that's allocating 50% towards dividends and leaving 50% towards government. Where does that leave us? It leaves you, this is not statutory dividend, just 50%. This leaves you with a deficit basically every year starting 2023. How big are the deficits? This is how big the deficits are. That's the orange bar, shows you the deficits by year if you decided to do 50-50. Now, to some of you that may not look very big, I will just say the following. This is a deficit with 50-50, which means not with the statutory dividend, and with permanent funds still performing well, with oil prices staying where the Department of Revenue thinks they're gonna stay. So I'm just gonna stop, let Ralph talk, and I can kind of just show you the next few slides. And again, this will be available. I don't think there is, yeah, this is just a decomposition that I like to share, but I think I'm done.
Mouhcine, a couple of questions did come in. One is, I think, quite a good question, and that is there any information available about the impact of the pandemic on borough municipality income this year? I mean, obviously, many of them are dependent on sales taxes. Have you seen any data on that?
Yeah, Niels Andreasen shared with me some preliminary numbers. I mean, he's in a much better position to talk about whether they finalized them or not. They look very ugly in a lot of places, but I think that I was with him on Talk of Alaska a few weeks ago, and he said something that's important, which is there is a ton of variation as well, right? And so again, and surprising, communities that rely on bed taxes and on sales taxes, especially sales taxes that are driven by tourism, are struggling, while others have actually done better than expected, right? And so a lot of the data at the national level is saying state government revenues ended up holding up better than expected because property taxes held up fine, and sales taxes in certain places, in places that are not driven by tourism, were okay because people were still buying goods and services. So if you were taxing food and goods and services, you were okay. If you had government revenues that are dependent again on bed taxes, sales taxes, you were struggling. But I think he would be the source for the most up-to-date numbers.
The second question was about the role of inflation. What has been going on here? Oil prices have gone up and down. What's the deeper picture about what's going on with inflation, and how does that impact even national a sense of what the future?
Well, I think that, I mean, I'll have to say this carefully. I think of inflation as a second order problem. I think that it's normal to be thinking about inflation given the size of the stimulus money, given how aggressive the federal government has been. And there is no doubt that prices, especially producer prices, in the last few quarters have run very, very hot. The Federal Reserve has chosen to prioritize economic recovery over inflation fears. And Chairman Powell has stated multiple times that they were going to remain accommodative as long as the economy is in a hole. He said something very unusual, which is they're not going to rely on forecasts to start tightening. They're going to wait for real numbers to emerge, meaning for actual recovery to happen before they start tightening. That's a very different message from what we've had in the past, and it's a very different strategy. Now, does this mean that we're not seeing consumer prices go up? That's obviously not true, because any of us that go to the store see that prices have been picking up. So there is inflation in pockets of the economy. There is no doubt about it. The housing market is another one of those big question marks that's kind of floating around. But I don't, it's tricky to now, if you're the Federal Reserve, to start thinking about reining in inflation when the labor market is in such a tough position. I'm of the opinion that they're perfectly equipped to tighten if they think the economy is running too hot. I know that there are people that think that they may be able to control near-term inflation, but it may run away from them. I'm not so sure that that's the case. And again, if I'm Alaska, I'm less worried about inflation than I am a recovery in the labor market. I think that that's so if that means spending more money in order to get the economy to heal, I think that it's a good price to pay, no pun intended.
Mouhcine, there's been some coverage in the newspaper recently about that read into the housing price increase in Alaska, that it was being driven by people moving to Anchorage as they leave cities and they can work virtually. Do you see any evidence of population changes in Alaska that are doing that, or is the housing market our own internal? So
Dan Robinson also presented when I presented to Senate Finance, and I thought he had a really interesting commentary that the Department of Labor has been highlighting a lot, which is that Alaska has been losing people. I think everybody know that, or net migration has been negative, I should say. And he said something really important. He said that most people, when they hear net migration is negative, meaning the number of people coming in is fewer than the number of people leaving. When they hear negative migration is negative, they think, oh, a lot of people are leaving Alaska. The point he made is that that's not necessarily true. What's true is that there are fewer people coming to Alaska. And that's one of the reasons that net migration has been negative. And why is that the case? That's the case because other markets are more attractive. Our budget's been in tatters, and so there's been a lot of uncertainty. And so I haven't seen a lot of evidence that there has been this surge in migration to Alaska as a result of the pandemic. It doesn't mean it's not happening. And I don't know. I've been very honest and forthcoming about the fact that I don't feel I have a very good handle as to what's going on in the housing market. I'm not sure I understand the enthusiasm. I know that interest rates are low. I know that people have been able to save and therefore have been able to afford down payments that they couldn't before. But I'm not sure. And there were headlines in the Wall Street Journal that were very intriguing about pension funds buying up a lot of properties, not necessarily in Alaska, but in a lot of markets. So this demand may not necessarily be driven by households, by pension funds that are accumulating properties. And then there's been evidence that people are buying second and third homes. And so there may be demand from other markets that's coming. As you say that, I just switched to a different slide that I think is important. Policy uncertainty is crippling. And I'm not putting words in the mouth of the Department of Labor, but I did an analysis in 2019 that was showing that policy uncertainty costs the state money, makes people reconsider wanting to live in Alaska. And so if we're thinking about attracting, retaining talent, it's really important to reestablish that urgency when it comes to fixing the budget. I know that's not what you asked, but I think that that's an important point to highlight.
One question is about the pandemic. Obviously, it caused unemployment in particular sectors, but it's also shifting the demands in some parts of our workforce. One question is, should we be spending, the state or nationally, should we be thinking about spending some of this funds to help our workforce adjust to the changes in the economy? And is that a feasible strategy? Is there talk about it nationally?
So look, I mean, retraining programs and making sure that the labor force is equipped to take the jobs that will be available, that are available, is important. It's easier said than done, right? And so, and the evidence on retraining programs is mixed at best, right? And so, because forecasting what will be hot in Alaska 10 years from now is tough. We know that we've been an oil-driven state. Right now, we have 6,300 jobs that are directly in oil and gas. So kind of pivoting quickly is important. However, as I've been saying over the last few months, thinking strategically about what Alaska 2.0 will be is important, and allocating resources to train the labor force is important as well. I work at the university, so adequately funding a university, adequately funding programs, and making sure that you have talent that can take those jobs is absolutely necessary. I've railed in every talk I've given over the last 10 years that Alaska does not have a diversification problem, has a leakage problem. That leakage means a lot of value gets generated, a lot of value leaves. Part of the reason why a lot of that value leaves, in addition to profits leaving, is that we have a very high share of non-resident workers. Why do we have that high share of non-resident workers? Because we have mismatches between what the population is equipped to do and what jobs exist. So that's my answer to the question.
Mouhcine, when you were putting in some of the projections and using some of the state data on what happens to the budgets under various scenarios, and of course we show this kind of smooth increase in the surplus under some assumptions over time. Behind that are a couple of assumptions, and would you comment on those? One is, of course, that the 5% POMV is actually sustainable in the current market. And the second one is that do these assumptions have built into them flat government spending in nominal terms? So it's actually
So you're absolutely correct, and I think that it's really important. So I mean, again, I'm showing this not to say I believe it. I'm showing it to say we actually need to be cautious. You've already highlighted a couple of them. So the assumptions here is the red line is using literally FY 2022 levels, right? And so, and it's basically just saying that's the level we're going to keep it at, not taking into account inflation, not taking into account additional spending, not taking into account anything. So it's an illustrative exercise that in my opinion, this shows even under assumptions that are unrealistic, the size of the quote unquote surplus is not sufficient to do everything we want to do, right? And I think that the assumptions are too rosy. So to be clear, this has in it that oil prices are going to be at the level that the Department of Revenue assumes. It also has in it, which is mid-60s. It also has within it, as you said, that the permanent fund is going to keep churning those returns. The stock market is going to do fine, right? So it doesn't have within it hiccups, if you will. And it has within it flat nominal spending, which means that, again, that these are essentially cuts to state government, because we know that there are components of the budget that have been growing much, much faster than inflation.
Well, Mouhcine, I want to thank you very much for walking us through the state economy, the impact of the federal stimulus package, and set us a context for thinking about the choices that still face Alaska. And I think we all walk away from this with your takeaway, which is the 1 year amount of money we're going to get from the federal government has not changed the underlying challenges for both the state economy and for the state budget. So thank you very much for doing this. We really appreciate it. And I want to thank the audience for, once again, for joining this webinar. We're very pleased that ICER has an opportunity to help Alaskans better understand the issues and choices that are in front of them. So thank you very much.